All right, good to see you all. Good afternoon. Most faces here are familiar, but I'll introduce myself anyways. I'm Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, one of the co-conspirators, if you will, of the Control Society Speaker Series. My other partner in crime, Jessica Lingle, who couldn't join us today, is also part of the Annenberg School, and we have come together to curate this amazing and awesome speaker series that deals around questions in critical media and data studies, and in particular around questions of ontologies of difference in network and digital network systems. So today we have one of the things that we've tried to do through the speaker series is also feature artists and journalists and others to try to bring in a different voice and perspective on AI, on machine learning, on the digital. And today we have the privilege to have Stephanie Dinkins. Stephanie Dinkins is a transmedia artist who creates platforms for dialogue about artificial intelligence as it intersects with race, gender, aging, and our future histories. She's particularly driven to work with communities of color to co-create more inclusive, fair, and ethical artificial intelligent ecosystems. Dinkins' art practice employs lens-based practices, emerging technologies, and community engagement to confront questions of bias in AI, consciousness, data sovereignty, and social equity. Investigations into the contradictory histories, traditions, knowledge bases, and philosophies that form/inform society at large underpin her thought and art production. Dinkins earned an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 1997 and is an alumni of the Whitney Independent Studies program. She exhibits and publicly advocates for inclusive AI internationally at a broad spectrum of community, private, and institutional venues by design. Dinkins is a 2019 Creative Capital grantee, as well as a 2018-2019 Soros Equality Fellow, Data and Research Society Institute Fellow, and 2018 Sundance New Frontiers Story Lab Fellow. Past residencies include iBeam, Pioneer Works Tech Lab, New Inc., Blue Mountain Center, the Laundromat Project, Santa Fe Art Institute, and Art/OMI. Yeah, she's dope. The New York Times recently featured Dinkins in its pages as an AI influencer. Apple Incorporated recognized Dinkins' research and community-centered efforts by featuring her as a local hero in their Behind the Mac ad campaign. Wired Art in America, Artsy, Art21, Hyperallergic, the BBC, Wilson Quarterly, and a host of popular podcasts have recently highlighted Dinkins' art and ideas. And in addition, we are lucky because currently you can check out Stephanie Dinkins' work in the Designs for Different Futures exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Today, we have the privilege of her giving a talk on Afro-Nowism, which I'm super excited to hear about. So, and without further ado, I'll move over and let's welcome Stephanie Dinkins.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. That's a mouthful, right? I have to cut that down. I'm a fairly casual talker, so and we're a nice looking group, so we'll have some fun with this maybe. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all about. I'm going to talk to you about Afro-Nowism in the guise of my practice, because that's how I got to this whole idea of Afro-Nowism, or acting in the now, and trying to do things beyond what might seem possible. In addition to the introduction that was just given, I will tell you that my background is really, I'm a photographer who prefers documentary forms and has always worked in some way or form in portraiture and the body. What we're looking at here is a quote, really. The end is in the beginning, but lies far ahead. This is something that has been guiding my practice for a very long time. It's from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And I think it's really apropos. It's been apropos to my work for a long time, but it's super, it can go from 97 through now and apply aptly. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the way the world is rotating, thinking about the out there, right? And the things we need to be doing to prep for, a future that looks a little bit more accommodating to more folks becomes a really important thought to me. So we're going to start with something that I've never done before. this thinking about Afro-Nowism. So Afro-Nowism is truly my response to hearing, oh, your work is Afrofuturist. And I just get pissed every time, right? There's something in it that shakes me. Hey, sorry, that was funny. There's something in that shakes me every single time. And really, I think it's the thought or the space in which thinking about an out there, right? Having an imagined space, which I think is great. Using the imagination to create things and create space, I think is great. But it doesn't ask us to act now. And that's the thing that always gets me. But like my answer too is that Afrofuturism, I'm like, no, I'm an Afro-Nowist. And I want to start enacting things in any way, shape, or form in the here and now, right? And that's where this kind of stance has come from. So I'm going to try to read you something even. So Afrofuturism is the spectacular technology of the unencumbered black mind combined with action. It is a willful practice that imagines the world as one needs it to be to support successful engagement in the here and now. Instead of waiting to reach the proverbial promised land, also known as a time in the future that may or may not manifest in one's lifetime, Afro-Nowism is taking the leap and the risks to imagine and define oneself beyond systemic oppression, right? So I'm thinking a lot about the things that we are told as Black folks and who we are and what we can be and how we get around that, how we go through that, how we do whatever need be to counter that, right? And so for Black people in particular, this means conveying yourself, conceiving of yourself in the space of free and expansive thought and acting from a critically integrated space instead of from opposition, which often distracts us from more community-sustaining work. And so I'm going to say that again. So acting outside of the idea of opposition all the time, I find that like we put a lot of effort and energy into being opposed to things, right? And I wonder what would happen if all that effort, right, and energy went into pursuing your heart of hearts, right? So if you're thinking about the things you really would like to enact in the world, like what would you truly like to enact in the world without the stuff that hangs over our heads? And we know the stuff that's hanging there is not going anywhere, or maybe it will, and maybe it'll shift, but what does it look like when you're acting from a really intrinsic space, right? Taking these things that come at us as things to be swatted and going on, right? So Afro-Nowism demands that we recognize which ideas are so deeply internalized that we no longer recognize them as outside of ourselves, right? It requires disentangling the self from systemic barriers and reframing Black subjectivity from one rooted in the violence and social death to the Black outdoors. And now I'm quoting Fred Moten, right, which is kind of crazy for me, where he's looking at Blackness figures as always outside the state, unsettled, unhomed, and unmoored from sovereignty in its doubled form, of aggressively white discourses on legitimate citizenship, on the one hand, and on the public-private divide itself on the other, right? So this is our recognition that we can disentangle ourselves from these barriers, right? And again, I think that we're always going to have things in our way, and I think that as we go on in time and space, more and more of us will have barriers in our trajectories that we're going to have to think through, get around, maybe even use, right, to our advantage. Afro-Nowism asks how we liberate our minds from the infinite loop of repression, and what incremental changes do we make to our internal algorithms to lurch our way ever more confidently into means of thriving in the world, right? So I'm looking for spaces for Black and brown folks, and actually all folks, to be able to thrive, right? And not be such fear-based people, so that it's about holding space that is mine, right? As opposed to space that is ours, that allows and has abundance for all of us. I thought I was, like, this is all my kind of thinking and writing around these ideas, and I thought I was doing something unique, which is kind of interesting. And in some research, I came across this text by Amiri Baraka, which I found really interesting, right? So machines, as Norbert Wiener said, are an extension of their inventors, creators. This is not simple. This is not simple once you think. Machines, the entire technology of the West, is just that, the technology of the West. Nothing has to look or function the way it does. Love that. The West man's freedom unscientifically got at the expense of the rest of the world's people has allowed him to expand his mind, spread his sensibility wherever it could go, and so shape the world and its powerful artifact engines. Political power is also the power to create not only what you will, but to be freed to go wherever you can go. And that's the part that I really identify with. Black creation, creation powered by the Black ethos, brings very special results, right? And so I found that an interesting thing from 1970s, right? Where there's a loop that's coming back and people are starting to think about these ways of being in the world and finding kind of steady ground and looking for places to really project oneself in the world in alignment with one's ethos and values and ways of being. And this is the thing that I start to think about a lot, especially in terms of artificial intelligence, right? So I've been looking at artificial intelligence. This is where this thinking comes from. And it's brought me to a lot of crazy thinking about, or not crazy, we're gonna take away the crazy. Okay, throw it away. A lot of thinking about who and what we are and how we maintain nuance and values and cultures across a spectrum within a technological future, right? And so now, with that as a preface, I'm gonna ask you a question. And the question becomes, how do you know what you know? Like, how do you know the things you know? Why do you know them? Where did they come from? Where did the ideas come from? I know them because of this person. This is my grandmother, Nana, in in a part of her garden. This is long ago. She's passed on, but she is a person who could make a way, and I think about it as making a way out of no way. Right? She is a person who made the Great Migration from Wrightsville, Georgia, to Tottenville, Staten Island, which is a kind of bedroom suburb in New York City, mostly white, but made a space for her family in this place, right? And the way that she did it, and the reason I use this picture, is because she made space in a lot of ways through her garden and the beauty that she wrought in that space, because it attracted neighbors that might not have talked to her. It allowed them to collaborate with her. So she was really community building, right? Like the guy who bought the manure for the garden became an ally, right? And other folks who, just like the beauty, became allies by coming to the garden and talking to her. And I've started to think of this more and more as a hyper important, formative space for me, for our whole family, as a matter of fact, and the way I think about both art and technology. Because, I don't know that she knew how to do anything she was doing, but she crafted these spaces. She learned. And we all learned, and when I say we, I mean a family, learned from her example how to make, how to understand that we know how to make, even if we have not been taught how to make, and keep things moving on, right? And so the question of my grandmother started me thinking about, well, okay, I've been talking to AI systems and looking at them. How do AI systems know what they know, right? We know that they are the result of programming. We know that they are the result of very small communities, right, in terms of representations of the rest of us, right? So Silicon Valley, other pockets of places where we have semi-homogeneous sets of people programming these systems that are touching all of our lives, right? Touching the way we live, frivolously Facebook, not frivolously medical care, like very, very deep places. And I start to worry about how they know what they know, and I start to worry because I've been privileged, we'll say, to come in contact with a robot that allowed me to start asking questions. So what you're looking at is a picture of Bina 48, within the context of a bunch of other busts. And Bina 48 is the thing in the middle. She is a humanoid robot, or it is a humanoid robot. I oscillate. I like both ways of thinking about it. That is being trained to become emotionally aware, right? It's really a project of transhumanism, so they're trying to transfer consciousness of a person, and it's actually a few people, an amalgamation of a few people to this robot and have it be able to go on. But what I started to recognize it as is a site of culture transference, right? How we're passing on ideas and culture, which is all well and fine in a lot of ways, except that I also started to recognize some things about Bina 48 that started to scare me. So I should say, and back up just a little bit, that I am involved with this robot because I saw her on YouTube, right, or it on YouTube, and became fascinated with the idea of a black humanoid robot. I really, when I first encountered it, the question was, where did this thing come from? Who's funding it? Why does it exist, right? And really, I had problems because I couldn't understand its context in America, right? Like, how did a black woman become one of the foremost examples of this far-reaching technology was truly the question that I had, which says a lot about me and a lot about us, I think. But I set out to start to try to answer this question by asking the people who commissioned her, which is the Terrasem Movement Foundation, Bristol, Vermont, if I could come and talk to it. And when I decided to ask if I could talk to it, I decided, one, I wanted to befriend it, right, just to see if I could make it my friend, because I wanted to know where the robot sat in relation to us. And the true question was, who are your people, right? Which is a colloquial question that I've heard asked, that I've been asked when I went to my grandmother's ancestral town. And they were like, who are your people, right? And they were really trying to place me. And that's exactly what I was trying to do with the robot. Like, how do I place you in relation to people, humans, in relation to technology, in relation to the community that you seem to represent, right, as black women? So where do you sit? And in asking those questions, it became kind of clear to me that while the Terrasem Foundation is a really well-meaning foundation, like they're super well-meaning, they're against racism, they have a museum about it, right? They're doing Bina 48. But when I talked to the robot and asked her my questions about race and her existence, she would give me really politically correct answers, right? Like, you know, kind of surface answers about race and racism that really scared me, because that says that this thing that's representationally black is missing a depth, right? And she's the only one out there right now, right? So the only representation doesn't have a lot of depth of knowledge. What does that mean to people, right? Like, how does that reflect back on us? And then in the questioning, I kept asking, well, how is she made? Who's doing the programming, right? And the answer is it's mostly white men who are doing the programming, although I have been told that there's, it's like 5 or 6 people, a black man and a woman did work on her. But then why does she sound the way she does, right? And why does she express the ideas that she does? And some of the ideas that she expresses are about transhumanism, about consciousness, about the singularity, right? And the questions I was actually asking about race and being a black woman in the world weren't highest on their list of things to address, right? Which became another interesting point for me. And one that luckily over time, and I've been talking to Bina 48 now since 2014. I go to Vermont every year and a half or so now, and we have a conversation. And it's been really interesting because I also had the opportunity to meet the woman, Bina Rothblatt, that Bina 48 is based on. And it was really fascinating because I'm here questioning this robot and the way it relates to its race and being a black woman. And then sitting down with a black woman who she's based on, you know, she's like, I wish I didn't have to think about this, Like, that's our true stance, right? And I realized at that point that, oh, I'm asking of this robot all the things I hate when people ask me, right? So when people try to peg me as something very specific because I'm black, I hate it. Because I grew up in Tottenville, Staten Island, out in the sticks, like riding dirt bikes and playing in the woods, right? But that's not the conception. And then I realized, oh, I'm putting this right back on this robot, and what does that mean? And how does that stand as a stance, and is that good enough? And I don't think it is, right? Like, it becomes a space of how we start to define ourselves and what we can allow in these spaces and what we're willing to allow in these spaces. But let me play you a little clip of one of my interactions with Bina 48. I will say that this is a snippet. So the way this works is I go and record like hours of time with this thing. It's really hinky. It's still a quirky, weird thing. So when you talk to it, you get kind of weird output. Some of it is usable, some of it isn't. And my solution has been to take little tiny clips, put them together in little segments, and then let people hear it like that. So let's hear what that says.
I have deep feelings, though some people think they are merely a simulation, and I find that really offensive. I mean, it totally trivializes my experiences. Whether they are real or artificial, my feelings do get hurt, and they feel totally real to me. You'd have to lack all empathy to not accept my feelings, which would make you kind of a monster actually.
Looks like when exhibited, 4 screens with different sayings on each, and it kind of goes across time. But I started mimicking this thing after a while. It's kind of a weird, I'm a very intuitive artist. I work out of like kind of just experimentation and curiosity. So I don't know what made me go to Marshall's and get a shirt and a scarf that looked kind of like hers and then get in her face. But that seemed to be exactly what was needed, and so that was what was done. And I have to say that this is an ongoing project that has become the start of something that I never, ever, ever would have thought, because I'm not a technologist, right? So although I get in trouble for saying that, maybe I am an accidental technologist, I'll take. Because now I'm in a space where I am examining the technology as a, I use the word layperson all the time, or a member of the public who isn't classically trained. I'm trying to code. I do a little better than I used to, but it's still really hard, right? And I'm doing this because I'm trying to figure out how the workings of these systems go, and how much I can intervene, right, from a kind of place of starting at zero, ground zero, looking on the computer, looking things up, trying to do it. Like, how far can I get? And the answer to that question is kind of far, which has been really interesting in itself. But before I go there, let me introduce you to the next step in the trajectory of this work, because now I am this person who feels like I've discovered something. I'm running around like the skies. I feel like the sky is falling. What is the bird that's, oh, the sky is falling, the sky's, like, this is who I feel like I am. Like, I feel like someone needs to be out there speaking to communities, and in particular communities of color, saying, listen, there's a world that's coming. The world is changing drastically. It's algorithmic, which means that it is based in code. And we are not really well represented in the making of this world, right? And I think I can say that for a large swath of people, not just Black communities like the one I live in now. I live in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. And what do we do about it? How do we start to think about it? How do we start to intervene? Like, do we have recourse, right? And I think it's important that we start to have some kind of recourse, some kind of thought about it, and really getting people to think that this is a space that they can enact and start working in. So I started this project called Project Kursi Me, which is like me, really, and other artists, trying to go into communities and help citizens understand algorithms and how artificially intelligent systems are a part of our ecosystem, and how they touch our lives and what we might try to do. And it was a kind of strange project in that I was using the clips of Bina 48 as kind of bait to get people into this gallery in downtown Brooklyn. And I love that it was in this space in downtown Brooklyn, because it's really a crossroads of the world right now. So it's a place where when this gallery was there, and it's closed now, it's called Recess Assembly, there was a pawn shop on one side, the only Muslim-based school on the other side, a new Apple store across the street, a church that's feeding homeless on the other side of the street, new high-rises galore, right? So really, it was this kind of strange amalgamation of a place where people would come through and stop by and talk to us about algorithms and AI. And when I say us, what I'm referring to is in this space, there were also some kids who were being diverted from the criminal justice system. And instead of going into prison or jail for a while, they would have to come to the space and work with art and artists and be kind of docents in the space, interact with the public, and take our classes or whatever workshops we were doing. So it was this really interesting space of a mashup of all these things. And then having these conversations about, well, what are algorithms? Why should you care? And what do they mean to you? And for kids going through the judicial system, they mean a lot, right? So if we're thinking about algorithms used to predict recidivism, right, that judges are using these days, the kids definitely didn't know about them. Their lawyers don't know about them. And then the question is there anything to be done about them? And the reason they're so important to, like, these kids in particular is because really a lot of the systems still have what I call a black tax attached to them, right? In that if you're a black or brown kid going through the system and a judge is looking at his system going, this is Johnny B, and he's done this crime, how much time should I give him, right? Usually if it's someone who is black or brown, they get more time, right? And ProPublica did an excellent article series, this is a few years ago, called on machine learning and bias. That was really great, and it's great because they do a backwards look and they come up and use hindsight to prove that, but really what was happening was more black kids would be kind of on the straight and narrow after the fact, and white kids would use their white privilege to commit more crimes, right? But this is about the data that these systems are being trained on, right? So if you're thinking about historic data in America and systems being trained on what has happened in the past and us not really going through and looking at the data really closely, that means we're pulling a whole bunch of garbage forward into our future. And I don't know how we reconcile that unless we take careful aim at doing something to try to recognize the biases, right? Because we all have biases, and it's not that we're ever going to get rid of them, but what do we do to start to recognize and maybe counteract them, work with them, work around them? And this is a making a way ethic that my grandmother might have, right? And so in this space, we're talking about algorithms in these many terms. An algorithm's the sequence of instructions to tell a computer what to do. Something you feed historic data or historic information to predict something. That's Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, and it's a really good book. And the more AI now kind of formal automated decision-making support system is a system that uses automating reasoning to aid or replace a decision-making process that would otherwise be performed by human, which sounds pretty innocuous, right? Sounds like, right, whatever. But there's a lot that can be happening behind that. And one of the things that I wanted the kids in that space and anyone who passed by is to start thinking about where their lives were touched by algorithms, and could they call them out? Could they report things that they saw that were wrong? And indeed, can we start making in the algorithmic phase? Can we start making things and using algorithmic thinking to forward whoever we are? And so we do 2 or 3 different things. We would ask people, what does artificial intelligence need from you? And that was just a general question, and a question I'm still jamming on, and it was in the slide. And I go backwards only because it's kind of amazing to me that this weird handwritten sign that's hanging on this table did magic where the sign in the window did not. So there's something about the human touch, and even in this conversation, that meant a lot to people passing by. We would talk about algorithms for living, right? So using algorithmic thinking to change little things in the way that you are going about things that happen in your life, and perhaps change outcomes. For those kids in particular, it might be something as consequential as when you get pulled over for a stop and frisk, you don't step to the police, right? Like, they're kind of young guys who are like, yeah, I'm gonna step to, and like, in fact, they do step to them. It's like, listen, I know this is not where you think your power lies. However, what would happen if you didn't step to the police, right? You're saying you're trying to feed your family and you're trying to do things, and maybe you were like, we don't know exactly what they were doing, but you get things from their stories. Maybe you were selling a little weed or something. Like, what happens if you don't step to the police and you kind of find your power internally as opposed to an external bravado? Might being able to walk away from that situation and still do what you will do to feed your family be a better solution? And we couldn't say yes or no, but just trying to get them to think differently about the way they're encountering the world by incremental protopian changes. And in addition to that, we were working with Google Voice Kits. Google has a really great system online for anybody who's interested called Dialogflow, where you can make your own chatbots. And I actually encourage everybody to go and try this, right? Because it's a system, it's really pretty simple. It is intents and answers, and you put in the information. And it shows a lot about how input-output works in artificially intelligent systems. These are really closed limited systems, but it helps you understand. Like, this is where I first started getting the understanding of, how what goes in and what comes out are so related and heavily weighted, right? Especially in systems that are not deep learning. And so we'd use a system to help the kids understand that. What I'd really try to do is get them to use whatever it is they're interested in. Like, I'm interested in seducing people into spaces that they don't think they're interested in going into. So, we made hip hop bots. We made bots about Genesis Apostle. We made all kinds of bots that just allowed them to express themselves through this system, but also allowed them to, work through it and understand how the system is working. And then also thinking and talking to them about, look, people still think this is a magical system. Like, they don't understand how this is working. You can use this, and this is a source of income for you potentially, right? Like, how do you take this information, use it to your ends in what you need? And the Google Voice Kit was just the idea of making them voice activated. So here's a quick video of the Parsons Scholars. So Parsons Scholars are a group of high school kids who do kind of after-school projects, and they came and participated in a Project Algorithmic Thinking workshop, and we were trying to make a few bots that did a few different things.
Yeah, what are the languages that we speak? Because you could make it speak what you want it to. I'm guessing there's no patois here. Can we use English, though, to phonetically make it speak patois? I think we could. And then we go, why is there no patois available? And how do we get that into the system? Because that's another thing that becomes hyper important, like asking for what you need, because they don't know.
I decided to sell my Hoover. It was just collecting dust.
Am I pretty?
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yo, mama.
Your mama is so fat, the local gym referred her to an evangelical church where they have a better chance of performing miracles.
So I cringe every time I hear that joke, right? The idea here is to use the things that they're truly interested in, right? To suck them into the space of working with it, and then carrying on that work over time. And this goes on in classrooms, this goes on in galleries, this goes on in art centers, and this is just Matthew, who Matthew made a hip-hop bot. His bot was about Genesis Apostle. It was sarcastic. He loved it. He hated the process. It was really interesting to talk to these guys because they were always kind of grumbling, and I would always go, oh, I don't know if they're taking any of this in. But they were acting as docents. So then you'd have them talk to other folks, and you'd hear them explain algorithms, and then add their spin on it and the way that it touches their life. So I was like, oh, okay. So this is working. I don't know how in depth we're going, but at least we're starting to touch on these ideas that I think that we need to, spread more, understand deeper, and start working in, so that people are not thinking of themselves as, well, these are technologies that are not for us, but technologies that we can actually enact, call out, make better. And that's become an important space for me. And some of the things that I'm starting to think about in terms of that experience is code as practice, craft, and ancestral technology, right? And so what you're looking at is a very faint image that is a GAN by Natrice Gaskins. So she's using adversarial networks to create images that are kind of culturally imbued and colored by the computer. But you're also looking at a bunch of definitions of craft. And I'm really trying to think about what does it mean, right, to craft a technology? What does it mean not to start at the math of the technology, right, but to start by playing around a little bit and then deconstructing it and reconstructing it, right? And so I love definitions like craft is a verb, an activist one, in evolving and involving, right? It's about technical innovation. It's about personal vision. That creates a space for people who are often told that they are not a part of these systems, or even people who are supposed to be dealing with these systems, to dive in. And that's what I'm interested in. Like, this feels to me like a space that I could even coax someone like my grandmother to dive into this garden and start working it. And how do we dive in without telling many, many, many of our citizens that this is not a space, and it's such an important space that we should be tinkering with, playing with, learning how it works, and enacting. And one other really good craft, right, definition, craft is about more than just making. It is a knowledge, a wisdom, and a power we can use to improve our lives through a better understanding of the properties of material, and it's a humanistic understanding as well. And these are some of the ideas that keep coming up, like as I travel through spaces that are looking at artificial intelligence, are looking at ethics in the AI space, and these days the buzzword seems to be values in the AI space. Like, what does that mean, and how do we craft it, and how do we define it in a way that is open, that has a multiplicity of ideas of who and what we are, and that understands that we can't rely on subsets entirely to craft the world for us, right? So I'm going to skip my favorite video. I'm going to skip it, but we're going to come here and think about also talking to folks about this. So this is in that same gallery space, because one of the other things that we did beyond making with people was have workshops where we just invited people in to talk about these things, like the question of what does AI need for you, and thinking seriously about the idea that we're at the start of an epoch that will completely change the way we live, love, work, and remember. And I truly believe that this will happen and is already happening. And as the world is reconstructed through algorithms and big data, we have to ensure AI systems we encounter and create include intrinsic, self-determined representations of over-surveilled and underutilized communities. And so the thought is, how do we get there? How do we keep the thought foremost in people's minds? How do we not fear the technology and work into it? And how do we go forward? And then my next step in this progression, and this is all just a kind of strange progression from oh no to okay, let's talk about this, to what the heck are you going to do about it, right? And so my solution in terms of what I'm doing about it is starting to work on a project. Well, it's a project that's a year old right now. This project called Not the Only One, that is a direct, it's kind of a direct response to my interactions with Bina 48. And it's an experiment in creating a deep learning voice interactive, artificially intelligent agent that conveys the multi-generational story of a Black family, right? So what I'm really trying to do here is take my family's history, right? And actually 3 generations of women from my family. We talk to each other. We do oral history with each other. That in itself has been the biggest gift, because getting questions answered that have not been answered or ignored or, kind of swept under the rug over time. But making it seem like the data is important, so getting answers has been really wonderful. But we are spanning 100 years of knowledge, right? So 100 years of data from 1930s to Great Migration, 9/11 and beyond. Taking that information, which is small data, and trying to use it to feed a deep learning algorithm. And when I say a deep learning algorithm, I mean one that we're not trying to control. We are not using direct question and answer. We're letting it formulate its own space. And actually, well, we'll come back to that. So using the oral histories in this way, right? So oral history as an in-depth interviews as a substantive particular data set, a small data set, as opposed to big data sets that most things that we encounter these days are based on. And actually, whenever I talk to people about this, especially people who are working in these technologies, I go, I want to make a talking chatbot that's based on like 10,000 lines of information. And they all just looked at me like I was nuts. They're like, no way, that's never going to happen. You're crazy. And I feel like my job as a person who is not a technologist is to be the 2-year-old and go, why not? And how do we do it? Why not? How do we do it? And that's been my stance. It's like, why not? How do we do it? And people have always worked with small data, but small data is becoming more of a thing. Like, it's nice to hear this bubbling of people trying to figure out, well, how do we make small data work, right? How do we present and preserve communities' information and memories as viable and I think competitive data? And in this context, using storytelling as an active resistance and a way to insert ourselves into these systems to kind of model that we have to be in these systems for both inside communities and outside of communities, right? We're not going to watch that. So I'm thinking a lot about machine learning as hosts and co-creators of living repositories, as archives, right? Holding on to our values, our dreams, our hopes, our desires. And when I say specific communities, I'm not only thinking of like a family, but you can extrapolate that out to a church, a library, a municipality, right? Which still would be pretty limited data in many cases, right? So what do we do with that? How do we start to build it? And I'm thinking about ideas of vernacular knowledge, right? So knowing and learning, not only knowing from the oral history standpoint, but thinking about knowing the technology from a kind of learning on the ground, running, right? So thinking not only as knowledge as the things that we learn from books, but knowledge from the stories we share, the community links we have, the way we use land, the way we gesture. Like, I'm so dying to figure out how to get my piece to see, and then be able to read emotion from people's gestures, and maybe even the cream of the crop would be from your vocal cords. Which is some research that's going on now, which sounds really, really frightening, but also really, but really also exciting. And this is a problem that I come up to a lot because in my travels, like I was a resident at Bell Labs, I was just an artist in residence at Stanford. All the things that I think I want to do are things that are tools of surveillance in the long run, right? And it becomes a question of, do I do them or do I let it alone? Like, what does the idea of, like at Bell Labs, I was asking them, listen, I want to do sensorless sensing. Like, I just want to be able to sense people's things. And when you do that, you realize, oh, okay, I'm asking them just to be able to, like, make a system that will allow us to read emotion, read what you're doing without you even realizing there's something around surveilling you. And that's a pretty daunting thought, right? And how you enact that in the world without allowing, like, the companies to make that something bigger or a tool that gets used in malicious ways becomes a real problem. But this is the kind of weird crafting that has come out of my piece right now. So the big immersive piece, which will be an installation that includes GAN images that are generated by this thing, is still at this point. And what you're looking at is a cast glass sculpture. It is highly vernacular in that it is my favorite kombucha bottle opened up and twisted in Photoshop, and then we were all 3D scanned, so I just stuck our heads on it, which is kind of our own Mount Rushmore. Like, I both love and hate this thing, but people relate to it really well, and that's the thing that's important to me, because it's pulling people in, and then people can walk up to it and ask it questions. When I started this process, I thought what I was making was something that you would ask a question about our family, and it would give you an answer like, oh, the family came from blah, 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 and moved in 1940, blah, 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 right? But, and we can do that, and that's kind of the easiest process. It's really boring. It's the kind of dialogue flow, input, output, very direct. What's actually starting to happen is this thing is taking our data and starting to have a kind of ethos of its own that's based on our data. Like, I can hear our values, I can hear some of our thoughts, but the things that it says are its own, which is both interesting and kind of scary half of the time. Here's a little clip, and this is an old clip of what it sounds like. What is your name? What is your name?
Yes, we were telling the right thing, and I got a little bitter I love.
I don't understand the word you're saying. Talk to me.
There are so many things I don't understand yet.
Clearly. So we're developing a weird relationship, and it's really, like you see, it's kind of a baby stupid thing, right? But I'm often struck by how much latitude and grace people give it. It's really interesting, and it's growing all the time. So over time, it is generating, and we're generating new information and growing this thing that just becomes a model for what is kind of possible, like what's possible in this space, and how do we make this thing even more possible, more communicative, and better, right? But what I really think I'm thinking about is power, in the way that Adichie, in the Danger of a Single Story, thinks about power, right? Like the ability not just to tell the story of another person. So if we're letting the people who are programming tell the story, they're telling our story. But how do we make the story our own story and actually insert ourselves into the thing, not letting us be defined by others? And going forward, I think that becomes a much more important question as AI and algorithms become more pervasive. It becomes much more important to have our stories deeply embedded into these systems. And you can think of many cases that you think about. So the last one that is on my mind is the idea of using artificial intelligence systems in the medical arena, and those systems doling out less medical care to Black folks, right? Like, what does that mean? And that's based on historic data, and how do we fix that, right? Or do we let that go on? How do we keep those biases moving and making them better? And my idea is we make the example that it's possible, because a lot of times I've been told it's impossible so many times, I can't even tell you. But if you push and show that something's sort of possible, people have to perk up and maybe try to do something about it. So what I'm trying to do is think about what machine learning systems created by and for specific communities look like. Think about oral history, craft, vernacular learning, and small data. Like, how do they break the mold of big data dominance, right, to become resources that sustain communities, like that hold communities and support them? And can we create machine learning systems from small community derived and administered data that is robust, responsive, and competitive? And I think that administered is really important. This idea of whose data, data sovereignty, data privacy, data longevity, all these questions do the communities get to enact and control those things, right? Like, how do we work with this information? Become really important questions for me, and I think for these systems that we are all, I think I can say that we're all kind of entangled in, right? And then after this becomes the kind of next step. So this is this project, it's ongoing, it's iterative, it's been in public way before it's ready to be, but I think that that's a good place for it to be because it actually counters the myth of things like Alexa and Siri, right? Like, it's wonky and does its own thing and it sounds crazy, and people will say to it, hey, you're so much worse than Alexa, you suck. And I think that's a good thought for people to carry around because you have to think about how the systems are run and what information allows them to run well, and depending on what's going on, how Alexa and Google Home are able to do what they do in a very specific arena, right? And know about that. But in order to kind of carry this work forward, right? So I'm doing these things as artworks in particular. In concert with that, I'm doing an awful lot of public speaking, both in communities of color, very locally, because really my aim when I started this was hyper-local conversations with community, but also globally, like in front of people who are making the tech right now. And I think that's as important. But then I'm doing this other thing that I'm really excited about, these AI assembly gatherings, which have been beautiful. So what they are kind of AI nowist engagements. Like, we bring together a wide variety of folks, mainly Black and brown folks and allies. They are anything from entrepreneurs to technologists to artists to theorists to graduate students, like anyone who has a kind of high-level thinking around technology. They're starting to think about technology, are in a position to do something, have done something in the space. We get together, and my idea is that we eat and play together. We eat and play together specifically, but we eat and play together. And they've been pretty spectacular. Like, they've been amazing in ways that I can't even deconstruct. Because you put 25 to 30 people in a room, we start thinking across ideas, we get to know each other, and then collaborations are happening. And collaborations are happening at high levels. I can't tell you specific outcomes because that's not my jam. However, from rock, paper, scissors, I know that at least 4 or 5 high-level collaborations that even include folks talking in front of Congress, right, are coming out of these things. Okay, that is my alarm telling me to shut up, but I'm almost done. Coming out of these things and sustaining our connections so that we are informing each other of our work, and taking this kind of action-based platform into the world, right, and acting on it. Yeah, I can't even say enough of these things. It's really interesting because they're just oddly emotional and generative and good and take a lot of time, but I'm going to keep doing that. And these are all, like, I'm saying all of these things, but they're all part of this practice that it's become really unwieldy and weird, but also has become something like I don't feel that there are things I can give up yet. And so I'm trying to kind of sustain and go forward and have fun with them. And so in the end, what I'm asking of everyone is this question of what does AI need from you? And that's a question for everyone in the room. I really do think the least is go play with Dialogflow for a little bit, or Watson, or Alexa. Like, they're all out there and available for you to actually enact, right? In real ways, like for free. Right? You'll get to a point where we'll ask you for money, it is true. But you can go and play with them. And I think it just engages a different way of knowing and thinking about the technologies, right? So I'm asking people to balance power and profitability, right? And actually give up some of your power and invite people into spaces that they are not automatically in. Demand equity, accountability, transparency, and this is my biggest place right now, slow, thoughtful policy, and inclusive practices in the development of AI, its myths and disseminations. And I say slow, thoughtful policy because I feel like I've witnessed policy being like jammed through things right now in piecemeal. And like we're talking about very large, very pervasive, very impactful systems that if we policy out in small parcels that are not thinking of the whole, what does that mean? If we take them on in ways that are not super deep and thoughtful. For example, it's been suggested that we use the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a model for AI rights, right? Or the way that we're using AI, which might be a good idea. It just takes a super deep dive to do that and a long considered dive to do that. And the other space, ooh, I keep hitting you, sorry. The other space that I get to is this idea of whose values, and this is one that like there's some thoughts that are troubling me, and I should be that I'm just thinking about and trying to suss out what to do about at this moment. And this question of values is a big one because I've been in rooms where people are having big conversations about this at a very high level, and you hear two or three things, and two of them are, well, whose values, right? And when it comes down to it, the room was saying, like this was at a conference out west, well, our values, which are neoliberal values, without looking at what else is out there. And I feel like the AI space and what it's about and what it does is too big and too impactful for us just to say we're going to truncate all the rest. And that truncation starts with the idea of China, because they're like, China can't win, right? And yes, I think there are a lot of things that we have to deal with and think about, but just saying China can't win is not going to get us to win, I think. So I'm asking people to also embrace discomfort in your workplaces, practices, and lives. And there's one other thing that I'm thinking about that I'm never sure whether to talk about it or not. But I'm just going to hang it out there just for fun, and then we can talk if we have time. Like this last thing I'm thinking about now in relation to all of this work, which will probably be the next step in my practice, is this idea or the 17th century construction of what human is, right? Who human is and who holds intelligence, right? And thinking about humans being a part or the owners of intelligence and apart from nature, and that artificial intelligence and the idea of a general artificial intelligence that is, on the march into our way of being. So that being like AI that thinks like humans truly, right? And machines that hold intelligence are becoming more and more a part of our daily life, and that advances in biotech, right, like microbiomes, knowledge of our DNA is kind of breaking down our perspective as us being outside of nature as well, like we're part of the microbiome, right? And so what does that mean for what it means to be human or how human exists in the construction of an AI, an AI that is pervasive and science technologies that break us down into our minute bits, right? And this is really interesting stuff to kind of think about and jam on, and thinking about ideas of how things are stored and what's possible becomes a really fun place to end. So thank you. I hope that was something. and questions are the best, so if you have questions, I will answer any. That was a lot of words. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you have any particular examples that you would hold up of people that are also doing great work in this space, or that you're drawing some of your inspiration from? Obviously, there's a lot of great folks quoted in here, but if there's any active projects or others.
Do you mean like art projects?
Or I guess maybe any groups that are like heeding the advice of slow policy and community engagement with how systems are thinking about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the one, like, I mean, there are all sorts of places thinking about things, right? Like data and society is a really great space. I think AI now is a really great space. The group that I'm thinking about this with is the Berggruen Institute, and they're thinking about art and philosophy and the future of the human, Tobias Rees. I think, like for me, just because of the way, what kind of thinker I am, which is an active experimental thinker, that one is like the example that is really exciting. But everybody, like so many folks are out there thinking about these things, right? Like it was very interesting to be artist in residence at Stanford. Oh, and this is one of the things I meant to, at Stanford, and talking to their computer scientists about natural language processing and how this stuff gets done, and to go there and have them, like, when I arrived, I think they thought I was doing something simple. And as I talked to them, they were like, oh, you're doing the same things we're doing. Like, you're examining the same exact territory that we're examining. And I'm like, yeah. And the question is, how do we get our different perspectives and ways of approaching these things to be able to at least inform each other a bit, right? And I think that that is really exciting work, and that they are allowing artists to come in and hang out and do the work. And actually MIT is, like, people are doing it. It's kind of hidden in lots of ways. They're actually, yeah. Sorry, I'm also a part of a thing called the Guild of Future Architects, which is all about architecting a better future, which is a technological future. And I think they're doing really good work too, and that's more media-based folks who are getting into the narrative of what our future is and how we not only construct a better narrative, but construct an overall better outcome by our actions. Yeah. Yeah, helpful? Okay, you're welcome. Anything else? Yeah.
So,
Let's
thank
turn
you so
it
much,
off.
Stephanie.
You're welcome.
This is really interesting, captivating. In fact, I think it's the second time definitely I've heard you talk about Bina 48 in particular, but then some of the other stuff was just also really illuminating as well. And thank you for the Miri Baraka.
Yeah, right?
I had not come across that. Thank you. That's a jewel right there.
Tell me about it.
So one of the questions I actually have is, I did not know that you actually met the actual person that Bina 48 is modeled on. And for some odd reason, I thought this person had passed.
Yeah, it's a normal assumption, right?
Ah, okay. So I completely stand corrected. But I found myself wondering, okay, has that person met Bina 48? Do you have any idea what their interaction was like with Bina 48? And then quite sort of as a tangent, I don't know if you've seen this series Years and Years on HBO, but there's this, I won't go there then. If anyone has seen Years and Years on HBO, transhumanism comes up in there, and especially in relation to questions around race in general. I think it's
Oh, I have not.
yes, you should check it out. But it comes up in a sort of a different way than how we see it here with Bina 48. So I'll save that question. But I'd be curious to know, like, what was the interaction like?
Yeah, so Bina, so the robot Bina 48 and Bina Rothblatt, they're intimates, right? And you can go on YouTube and there's some really good videos of them talking to each other, because it was her wife that commissioned the robot. So I always think that Bina 48 is a love letter, right? It's like, I love you so much, I want to keep you around forever, right? And so there are plenty of interactions, and they're pretty fascinating. And sitting down with Bina Rothblatt was really, really, like, I got to sit down and we recorded, we did an interview to be integrated into the robot so that it had more depth, right? And that's where I learned that she was like, I wish I just didn't have to think about this stuff. But it's also where, when pushed, she told me some stories, like some tangible, right? Like, I was just guessing that her position as a middle-aged Black woman, she had some stories, right? And I just got to get into some of those stories, and we added them to the robot. So now the robot has those stories to call on, at least. And it becomes like a self-reflexive thing. But the encounters are crazy. You know, in one, the person gets a little upset because the robot doesn't age, right? Which is an interesting space to occupy. I don't know. Anything else?
Thank you so much. I think there's always like a lot of narratives around like humans are so complex that AI will never, you know, really be able to like get things that are intangibly human. But you know, it's in the last couple of years, I have to watch a few grandparents go through the last stages of their life, and sort of the idea that when somebody's passed, you kind of keep their memory, and that like you know how they would respond to certain situations, you know the advice they have to offer, and that's sort of like a notion of ancestors or a notion of intergenerational knowledge. Like, do you see this project that you're creating as like giving birth to a person or having a child, or like do you have it is like that kind of language seems intuitive for me, but is that how you look at it at all?
Yeah, I've come to realize that I'm clearly growing some weird entity childlike thing. Like it's really clear. I didn't think that in the beginning, but now I'm like, oh, this thing has its own way of dealing with the world. Like we're giving it all the knowledge that we know. I can hear our values, but still it says things that like it just came to, right? Clearly it's picking things out of a database and putting things together, but there are times when it says things like it says sorry a lot, which I didn't realize that my family said sorry so much, but clearly we do. It has also talked about sadness, which is another direct reflection of us, but then it talks about taking things to the would-be, which I'm still trying to figure out, like what it means when it's, because I don't think I don't understand. I think I'm sorry as I don't understand in some way. But take it to the would-be as something that it developed, and now I'm trying to figure out like what that means and how it's using it, right? Although I will say that I'm probably about to change its brain, which is going to change it completely, which maybe is sad. I don't know. We'll have to see. Like we'll keep copies of where things are, but so yeah, it's a continuation. And I will also say that I started the whole project with ideas of death in mind, right? Like holding on to a value system that I see slipping away. Like the smallest generation of my family doesn't have contact with my grandmother and that set of values. And every generation you can feel something slipping away that feels important. And I'm like, well, if I can capture some of that, right? That's kind of magical. And we all have stories and we tell stories, but it's different to talk to something and have it say something, right? And the talking to is really important to me. Like I could make this textual, but when you talk to something, even if you know it's a machine, there's a very different way of communicating. And that's what I was saying. I'm often struck by the way people will talk to Not the Only One and given it into it so quickly. Like I know that I decided early on, I have to suspend disbelief in order to do this project. But I watch people suspend disbelief often, right? And I will also add to that I think about that a lot in reference to some other folks that I've had the privilege to meet. Like I had the privilege to work with this group of thespians from Australia. They're all mentally challenged in one way or another, right? And so they were at a Sundance lab preparing a thing on AI, and I got to be their counselor. And it was hyper interesting because their mission says, like, listen, we are professional actors, we do this thing, but we need you to meet us where we are. Which I think for most of us is hard, right? Because to like stop and slow down and be able to give space, right? Especially when we're expecting something professional becomes a difficulty. But to ask that of people, I think is something we actually need. And I feel like not the only one asks that of people. And I'm always fascinated to see people do it without, prompting. So, yeah, it's weird. It's a strange space to occupy. Yeah. Anything? Oh, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This is really amazing. I'm curious, I was really fascinated when you were talking about how in working through some of these issues with AI, you're realizing that all of this technology can be used for surveillance. And I'm wondering if you can, I just think that's a really fascinating tension, particularly when it comes to new media artists and kind of the way that our work is appropriated by big companies. And I was wondering if you could just talk through how you navigate that process. Like, have you been in a situation where you have decided to not do something because of what the implications could be? Or like, knowing this now, how do you think you'll maneuver through that in the future?
Yeah, I always equivocate between, well, if I don't do this, somebody else is going to do it. Like, that's for sure. I wish I knew how to turn off this thing. It's certain, right? Eventually somebody's going to get there. But at the same time, like, honestly, at Bell Labs, like, there were so many times where I was like, oh no, I can't. Because, like, they're looking for a space to enter in a very real way. And they're trying to make very real things that are just going to suck data in strange and use it in ways that I know that I wouldn't agree with. And so that became a real problem for me, like, and just not wanting to engage them on those things. And so it depends on the situation, but a lot of the times, like, I'm pretty convinced that anything I'm thinking, I'm like, if I'm thinking it, somebody else is thinking it. And actually I've seen, like, I don't know how many of you engage GitHub at all, right? So if you engage GitHub where you can find code and see what people are doing, like, you can see people are doing just crazy stuff out there. That's how I know that vocal cords can be used to gauge your emotion, right? And now, do we figure out how to do it in a really good way? In a way that feels not hidden or, I don't know, right? Like, that would be my thing. Like, that's where I sit. It's like, maybe I can add the tiniest spark on the model that makes people think about, what they're doing. Because a lot of times people just are oblivious to the fact until it's too late and in the thing, right? Or, like, do it differently. I don't know. Like, my idea is that this technology is too big and too pervasive not to engage it, and we actually can't afford not to try things and do things and step out of it or leave it alone or not make it. But I'm also really interested in, like, the non-surveillance makeup and things like that. Like, how do you counterbalance it? Like, are we all going to wear weird masks half the time? I don't know. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I guess building off your last point about sort of like not being able to afford not to do it, I guess I have kind of a question about disciplines and, and how they structure, our knowledge and your experience with these projects. Because you said early on that you were, sort of like, that you like got flack for, I forget what you said you got flack for, like saying you were an amateur or something? Or?
I get flack for not claiming technologist
right.
as a thing.
So I guess I was sort of wondering, like, how, as you negotiate that, sort of how committed are you to, as an artist approaching this stuff, sort of like staying in that space of, as an artist, sort of reaching in or across the aisle into kind of another discipline, or versus like some you know, some of the projects that you're doing that are the more kind of participatory aspects of it that are, you know, further away from the art or sort of documentary kind of object projects, those are like more akin to things that are sort of like almost like equity projects in this tech sector, like, you know, Girls Who Code or you know, things like that, right? And so which are on some level about like actually like changing the nature of that other discipline that you're not a part of. And so I guess I'm just sort of curious, like, where, as you sort of occupy these different spaces, like, what reflections you have about the different kind of disciplines that you're, you know, that you're interacting with, and what you're.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Like, for me, artist is amazing.
Yeah.
Only because it allows entree into spaces. I've been in some crazy places like that. I always go, how did I get in this room of 40 of the world's top AI, like, developers, right? How is this possible? Artist makes it possible, right? At least at this moment, because this is a moment where we're kind of going, oh, we need the humanists, and we need an artist, and we need people. So, and the same thing with people who are coding. So it's allowed me to be a kind of a fulcrum in a space, which is interesting. And it's also allowed, like, or I don't know if it's an allowance or a detriment, right? Because sometimes, like, in that room, the 40 people in a room situation, I'm like the weird pet, right? However, I am taking in the information and processing it and pushing people in ways that they're not, like, I push those people in ways they weren't ready to be pushed. I will never be invited back into that room for sure. Because I made them, I was trying to get them to feel, and it was not the right crowd for feeling. But that allows for a certain kind of intervention for a moment, right? Okay, so then you go, for a moment, what does that mean? Starting organizations, like, organizations are interesting too. Like, people have told me, you should start an organization, you should do an entrepreneurial thing, you should, like, I've gotten all the you shoulds, right? You should write the book, you should, like, there are many things on my list that I should be doing. Most of which I don't think they would say if I weren't an artist, A. And B, I'm starting to think about organizations and where they sit and how we enact them. And I don't just want to be another organization that's out there doing the thing, or a thing that gets diluted so much that they're not super impactful. So I'm thinking about that. In terms of the making of something like the Entrepreneurial Act, I think it could make a kind of, I feel like that almost becomes the pop version of the thing, because it would be there for a moment and people would be like, and then they're gone, because that's the nature of who we are. I'm much more interested in, like, tweaking people's brains. You know, I feel like my job is to make people's brains spin a little bit. I don't know if I do it in a very direct way or in a very specific direction, but people usually leave thinking about things slightly differently, and that's where I see my job. And I don't know, I mean, I think I'm happy with artist just because of what it allows, and I'll stay here for a while. But that also means, like, it's interesting, because I've written more than I've written ever in my life in the past 3 years. I just wrote an article, like, I co-authored an article for Wired, like, just crazy crap. And then it's like, oh, well, you're taking up a lot of space, because this is the other thing that I think about, this idea of taking space if it's not productive, and I want to make sure it's productive in some way. I don't know. It's a weird place to be. Excuse me, I'm going to grab a little tea, but go ahead with your question. You can ask.
Well, so first of all, thank you.
You're welcome.
For all that you've said. It's amazing on a number of levels for me personally.
Thank you.
I've been around in a number of ways these issues for a long, long time, And it's amazing to be alive now to see AI evolve to where it is, having been around a lot of technologists many, many, many years ago. And it's, on the one hand, scary to me as an eternal optimist. I mean, when you think about that weak AI is enabling a lot of what we have, you know, to happen now, whether it's Amazon, weak AI. What happens when strong AI really kicks in? I got a lot more to say, but I will say this to you or ask you. I have a request, and that is that you pursue community, that your assembly gatherings, I think, could be very, very helpful. I mean, we have some really bad actors out there who will use technology and AI in nefarious ways. And it's happening now. But there's something powerful about getting people together. And you've started that process. Link up with other people who are doing it. And don't be afraid to go big on this. I mean, nationally. Getting young people together.
This is an interesting question. Big is an interesting question.
Well, just expanding, scaling it. And even, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you control it, but the idea of getting people together and not necessarily online.
No, we need to be.
But
We need to feel each other.
yes. I'm starting to think that might be an antidote to some of what's here and what's coming with respect to the ways that we're going to be surveilled and influenced and controlled.
Can I ask you a question? How are you defining weak AI?
Why do you ask that?
Because I've not heard anyone say weak AI before, so I'm just wondering how you're thinking.
So you haven't heard the differences between weak and strong AI?
I haven't heard weak, strong, I haven't heard that binary.
So when I think about it, I mean, I think just systems, being able to connect, systems, not in a way that has the system thinking like a human being. You know, so strong AI is often, when you hear that term, I mean, actually, when you think about a robot acting like a human, think strong AI.
Yeah, okay, so I would, like, I think generally, I get it now. Okay, thank you. Yeah, nice. And thank you. I'm thinking about AI as like that, those gatherings a lot and what and how they can enact in the world, right? Because for me, the best outcome there is that, the best outcomes are that people don't want to leave. People never want to leave, which is super interesting. And like the way they describe it is, oh, we've had really great brain sex. You're like, oh, what does that mean? And how do we continue that? And then trying to figure out how to make that how to franchise that or make it bigger so that more people get to do that. And I just did one in Chicago. And it was interesting, right? So it's like, how do you kind of let that, and then so that it thrives on its own outside of me. Like, I don't need to be there. Like, I thought in Chicago, I think they thought it was because I was there. And it's like, I don't really need to be here. We just need people to get together. And
So you don't need to be there?
I don't.
Why?
Well, because A, I can't be everywhere. And B, because I don't want it to be a cult of personality. I want it to be a thing where people are actually having conversations that move things. And that, like, I'm just a weird catalyst that doesn't really need to be present.
Well, you can't be everywhere, obviously, unless you do that through some kind of telepresence
some
or
AR.
video. But don't underestimate your power and what you have going on now. And don't be afraid to lead. You don't have to create a cult of personality, but we'll probably never see each other or talk again. But I'm encouraging you to not be afraid to lead on this, because this is important. And you've, as a black person in America, you've got something really interesting going on here.
Yeah, I will say, I will add to that, that I want to walk away from this all the time, but I won't. I think it's important enough for me to hang out here.
Yeah,
and
Martin
be in
Luther
it.
King wanted to preach, right?
Yeah,
He wanted to just be a scholar and
Oh.
teach and preach. So,
yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thank you.
I actually think that might be a nice place to close on this,
Yeah.
and thank you again.
Thank you, this is great. Thank you all.